In this video, we're going to look at how we can measure the performance of an economy and how we can make judgments about how well our economy is performing. So in the last video, we introduced the idea of using GDP to measure economic growth, but that's not the only indicator of the success of an economy. We can also look at prices. How stable are prices? Are prices rising? That would give us inflation. What about jobs? Do we have a lot of people unemployed? That would mean that unemployment is high. We've talked about how we can use GDP to measure growth. And we also mentioned the idea that we need to look at our trade with other countries, and we call that the balance of payments, the difference between exports and imports. And that's influenced to some extent by the value of our currency or the exchange rate. But as well as these economic measures, we can also look at non-economic measures. After all, life is about more than just money, isn't it? So we might think about the quality of life. We might look at how good our environment is. We might look at the health of the population or education. So we're going to start by focusing more on economic growth, because this is probably the most important measure of how well an economy is doing. And it's the one that governments and many other people are probably the most interested in. And you can see that there are a number of different aspects of economic growth that we can look at. What's the potential of the economy? How is it actually growing? What's happening with output and expenditure and income and production? So we're going to have a quick look at some of those things. So, potential growth, when we talk about potential growth, we mean the overall capacity of the economy. In other words, what could we produce as a country if we used all our resources in the most efficient way? What's the largest amount of growth that we could possibly achieve? But of course, potential is nice to aim for, but economies need to measure their actual growth. What has actually happened? And we can measure that by looking at the annual percentage change in output or GDP. You will hear the terms nominal growth and real growth. So nominal growth is just the bare figures. That measures the growth in output, but nominal growth doesn't make any adjustment for price changes. So when we look at nominal growth, we're just looking at current prices. This tells us something, but the problem with nominal growth is when figures get bigger from one year to the next, when GDP is bigger this year than it was last year, we don't know whether our economy has really grown or whether it's just that prices have gone up. And that's why the idea of real growth is so important, because real growth adjusts the GDP figure to take account of those changes in prices. So it takes the price increase out. And we express that as constant prices. But why do we care so much about economic growth? Why is it important? Well, it's important because the wealth of our nation determines the quality of life often that people in that country have. And there is a very stark connection between economic growth and life expectancy that we're going to explore in this video here.
This shows income and lifespan in the world today. Each bubble is a country. Color shows region, the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And size is population. The big ones are China and India. And this is income, GDP per capita, from $500 all the way to $50,000 per person and year. And this is lifespan, life expectancy in years. These countries have the lowest income and the shortest life. And from this corner down here, there are countries at all levels, all the way up to this corner up here with the highest income and the longest life expectancy. There are no countries here. On this high income, there is no country with life expectancy below 74. And there is no country here. On this low income, there is no country with life expectancy above 64. But look at the big picture. Most people live in middle-income countries. And on the same income level, there are huge differences in lifespan, from 50 all the way to 75 years, depending on how the money is distributed and how it's used.
So that is the clearest and simplest reason why economic growth is important. As countries get richer, people in those countries get richer. We're able to look after our health better. We have more access to medicines and hospitals. We have better food, and so we're likely to live longer. And we could see in that previous graph on the video that that certainly is the case. So, what about UK economic growth? What this bar chart shows us here is what's happened to the UK economy between 2010 and 2018. And the black line across the middle of this graph is zero growth. We can see the scale on the left-hand side. So zero growth is along the middle. Anything below the line, so the orange bar right at the beginning, shows us that before 2010, and in fact that year is 2008, 2009, the UK economy actually got smaller. It got smaller by 4%. It was 4% smaller than it had been the previous year, and that came about as a result of the global financial crash. Since that time, every year there has been some economic growth in the UK, but it's been pretty slow. So you can see that between 2010 and 2012 to 14, economic growth was no higher than 2% per year. And even in 2014, which was the highest amount of economic growth in the UK since 2008, 2009, the economic growth there was still less than 3%. And since then, the economic growth has slowed down again. We're now in 2020 and we're all suffering as a result of COVID. And what we will see when those figures come out is another big orange dip. We will have negative growth. The UK economy has got smaller as a result of COVID, and so have the economies of almost every country in the world. So economic growth is important, but price stability is also important. And we call this measurement of prices, we call it inflation. So the definition of inflation is a persistent rise in prices in an economy over a period of time. This is measured in different ways in different countries. In the UK, it's measured by a thing called HICP, which just measures prices, really. It measures standard prices of standard goods that we all buy very often. The thing to remember about inflation is it never falls. It slows down or it speeds up. So the rate at which prices rise might be very slow or it might be very quick, but prices tend to rise. Very occasionally we do get a fall in prices, and we call this deflation. So inflation never falls, it rises at different rates, and if prices fall, we call that deflation. We're going to come back to this idea of inflation later on in the module. However, let's go back to the UK again and look at what's been happening to prices in the UK. And again, we've got the similar sort of period as we saw in the GDP chart, and we see that the rate of price rises changes. And interestingly, the graph for inflation moves kind of in an opposite way to the GDP. When GDP is rising, we tend to get a rise in prices. We also see here the difference between price growth and wage growth, and that can be important. The other indicator of how well an economy is doing is unemployment. In an economy that's succeeding, everyone would have a job, wouldn't they? So economies are very concerned about the unemployment level. If it gets too high, it means that the economy is not performing at its best. We're not using all of our resources. There is some labour that's not being used. So exactly what do we mean by unemployment? Well, the definition is a number of people of working age who are willing and able to work, but who cannot find a job. So they want to work, they're able to work, and they can't find a job. In the UK, sometimes we look at the claimant count. That's those people who are actively seeking work and actually claiming welfare benefits from the government. And there is an international measure of unemployment as well. But really, we're always looking at the number of people who are willing to work, they're looking for work, but they just can't find work. So we see here that at the time of the financial crisis in 2008, when GDP in the UK was falling, we see that the number of people out of work went right up to nearly 8%. Unemployment rose. But since our economy has recovered, unemployment has fallen. Unfortunately, with COVID, we're seeing unemployment rising already. Not just in the UK, but in many countries. And unemployment is bad, obviously, for the individual who doesn't have a job, but it also has costs to the economy as a whole. If I'm not working, I don't pay tax. If I'm not working, I may be claiming welfare benefits. Both of these are costs to the government and to the other taxpayers. There are social costs of unemployment. Crime tends to increase when unemployment is high. And there is, of course, that loss of potential output that we talked about earlier. The last economic indicator that we want to mention is the balance of payments, and this measures the difference between the value of everything that we export, that's both goods and services, the difference between the value of exports and the value of imports. And we're looking at goods and services that we export right across the world, and equally goods and services that we import from all parts of the world. To be successful, most countries would like their exports to be higher than their imports. We want to be selling more to the rest of the world than we're buying from the rest of the world. That means we're making money, doesn't it? So a good balance of payment situation is to have a surplus. In other words, exports are bigger than imports. Unfortunately, when we look at the UK, that is not the case. We see on this graph, the blue lines are the UK's trade in services. This is what we export. This is our net exports, so it's exports minus imports. The yellow lines are our trades in goods, exports minus imports. And here we have 0 in the middle. So we can see that in terms of services, the UK actually does export more services than imports, but we import far more goods than we export. And if we add goods and services together, we get the black line here that shows us that in total, the UK has a trade deficit. In other words, we import more than we export, and that's not good for our economy. And we can see that if we compare with China, again, halfway up the graph we see 0%, and we see that most of China's trade, their exports are greater than their imports. So that whereas the UK has a trade deficit, China has a trade surplus. It exports far more than it imports, and that's very nice and good for China's economy. The success of our exports and the amount of imports that we buy depends in part on the exchange rate, in other words, the value of our currency. If our currency has a high value compared with other currencies around the world, then it makes it really cheap for us to import goods, but it makes it quite expensive for other countries to buy our goods. So a strong currency is generally seen to be a good thing, but it does make a country's exports much more expensive. And we have here the changing value of sterling, and sterling is known to be a strong currency, and it remains a strong currency. However, the value of sterling has changed over years, and it has fallen and continues to fall against other currencies. So the other measures that we can look at are those ones that are non-economic, and we're going to look at that more closely in our next video.